All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. You know the drill. We asked for your input, and you definitely delivered. Today, we're going deep into the world of higher education, especially for those who are brand new to teaching in universities.
And the source material we're going to be taking apart is this really insightful book, The Lecturer's Survival Guide, an introduction to successful teaching in higher education.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many people have either been there or know someone who's been there or are just fascinated by the whole academia thing, right?
Right.
So we're really going to try to break down what this book says are the essentials for succeeding in the classroom, making sure students actually have a good experience and who knows, maybe uncover a few surprises along the way.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was reading through this guide was how it kind of tackles this almost universal feeling among new lecturers.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's that feeling of, do I actually belong here? Am I actually qualified for this? And this seems to be something that comes up quite a lot, regardless of someone's background. I mean, we're talking about people who could be coming in with years of industry experience. They could have, a fresh PhD under their belt, or they could be coming back after a career break. But they all seem to struggle with this sense of uncertainty and maybe even a little bit of self-doubt.
Oh, it's interesting because, you think about it, they are the expert, right? That's why they're there to teach. But then suddenly it's like, oh, there's this whole other skill set of actually teaching in academia. And I don't know, maybe it just kind of throws them for a loop a little bit.
Absolutely. And that's where the existing expertise they're coming in with it maybe takes a bit of a backseat to this feeling of, maybe being a bit of an imposter, not really knowing the ropes.
Right. Mm.
And the guide actually kind of looks at the support systems that are there to help people transition into these roles, things like PG CERT programs and mentoring, which are both, in theory, really beneficial. But what it highlights is that the impact of these programs can be quite variable.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
So if you think about a program like PG Surf, a lot depends on the group dynamic. If people don't feel comfortable asking what they perceive to be basic questions because they don't want to look silly in front of their peers, then they may not actually get the support they need.
Yeah, totally. If you're already feeling a bit shaky, the last thing you need is to feel judged for asking for, you know, clarification or for help.
Right.
What about the mentoring side of things?
Well, the guide raises a really interesting point about mentoring. It says that while obviously having a mentor is super valuable for new lecturers, just to kind of navigate, the practicalities of university life, there can be a disconnect if the mentor isn't really up to date with the latest pedagogical approaches or, the current strategic priorities of the university when it comes to learning and teaching.
Huh. Yeah, I see how that would be an issue. So you could have someone who's been trained in a particular way, but then their mentor's giving them advice. That's kind of,
Conflicting.
yeah, conflicting. It could actually make things more confusing.
Absolutely. And that's why I think a guide like this is so useful because it's trying to provide, a consistent framework, a positive framework for those who are new to lecturing. It's about saying, look, you have expertise, but here are the pedagogical expectations within this sector. And it anchors everything to a core set of values.
Yeah, okay. So what kind of values are we talking about here?
Well, the guide emphasizes, respect for students, obviously, ethical practice, the importance of inclusivity, and the need to foster a sense of belonging within the learning environment. And it really suggests that these should be the guiding principles for all teaching and all interaction with students.
I like that. That's a really solid, foundation to build on. And it makes me think, too, about the reality of being an experienced lecturer, which, from what I understand, it's a very, very busy role.
Oh, absolutely. The guide actually points to the huge volume of demands on experienced academics.
Hmm.
So we're talking about things like research, which is obviously a huge part of it, but also things like the TEEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework,
Right.
the NSS, the National Student Survey, module feedback, graduate outcomes.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
So the guide suggests that because of all of these demands, there's actually very little space for more experienced academics to share their knowledge with those who are just starting out. So even when there are mentoring schemes in place, the time that's needed to really have an impact on someone's teaching just isn't there.
Yeah. You can have the best intentions, but if
Yeah.
you just don't have the time, it's,
Mhm.
yeah, it's really tough. And it makes me think about people who aren't, full-time permanent staff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've got your part-time sessional visiting lecturers, and from what I understand, they often miss out on the more structured support.
Right.
So they might not be eligible for things like, PGC, say, or formal mentoring programs.
Exactly, and that can leave them feeling quite isolated, really.
Yeah.
And without that clear guidance on things like university policies or even just basic teaching expectations, they might be left kind of fending for themselves.
So it's not just, okay, I'm an expert in my field, I can now teach.
Right.
There's a whole transition that has to take place to actually adopt that educator identity.
Absolutely. And that's how the guide frames it. It says that the fundamental challenge is actually the shift from being a student, a researcher, a professional in whatever field, into being a lecturer in higher education. And this requires a system that's going to give them the right tools, the right knowledge to be able to do this new job.
So it's almost like passing the torch then.
Exactly. And that's what this book is trying to do. It's trying to, take all that accumulated wisdom and pass it on to help improve educators and enable them to adapt because the landscape of higher education is changing all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And that landscape is really shaped by data these days, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You've got your student surveys, your graduate employment figures. I mean, these things are huge.
They're essential, really. And things like the graduate outcome surveys, the point of those is to try to demonstrate the value of a degree in terms of a graduate's career progression.
Yeah.
And, the National Student Survey, the NSS, universities really look to that as a marker of whether teaching's going well. Is the assessment clear? Is it a good student experience?
So there's a lot riding on these metrics.
There really is. And I think it's really interesting how the guide makes this distinction between knowing and learning.
Okay, yeah.
And it actually draws on Carol Dweck's work to highlight this difference.
I like her.
So knowing is presented as that kind of internal sense that you understand something, but it can be hard to measure, and crucially, it can change.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Because, as new information comes to light.
It does, always.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas learning is something that can be assessed, something that can be demonstrated.
Right, it's more concrete.
It
And that's such a good reminder, because sometimes I think we can get comfortable and think, oh, we know something, and that's that.
Yeah.
But things are always evolving.
Exactly. And as Dweck would say, the knowledge you have right now is not the end of the story.
It's not the end of the book.
Right. The story continues.
Yes.
Facts change, new challenges come up all the time, and it means that continuous learning is really vital in higher education for both the lecturer and the student.
Oh, for sure. And that kind of constant state of change, it seems like it would require quite a bit of humility, right?
Absolutely. And the guide actually suggests that lecturers should be open to the possibility that their students might know more than them about certain things.
Whoa, okay.
And it's not meant to be embarrassing. It's meant to be a really great opportunity for collaborative learning because, none of us know everything.
No, we don't. That's very true.
And it's a great way to kind of create new knowledge together.
Yeah, I like that. It really shifts that power dynamic a little bit, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, we all think of the lecturer at the front of the room being the holder of all knowledge. This kind of breaks down that barrier.
Exactly. And then the guide moves on to actually talk about practical techniques for engaging students beyond just standing up there and lecturing.
Okay, what kind of stuff are we talking about?
Well, it really stresses the importance of active learning. So things like incorporating group work, but making sure it's really well-designed group work that's related to learning outcomes, not just, random group work.
Right, yeah.
Or using tools like Post-it note exercises to get quick feedback and see where students are at. Leveraging online platforms like Vivox, Kahoots, Mentimeter for quizzes, polls, really simple things to bring students in. And then, of course, just asking leading questions, being a bit more provocative to try and stimulate students' thinking.
Yeah, I like that. All of that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes it more engaging, it gets people involved, and you can kind of get a feel in real time for whether people are getting it. The other thing I've noticed, just, in talking to friends who are in university, is that they sometimes struggle to see the connections between the different parts of their degree program.
This is something that comes up a lot, actually, particularly for students who are new to higher education. Because in a modular system, it can be quite difficult to see how everything fits together. How what they're doing in their first year actually links to what they might be doing in their third year, and how that all feeds into the overall aims of the program.
So it's not enough to just teach each module kind of as a standalone thing.
Exactly. And the guide really stresses the importance of explicitly showing students those links. So showing them how the foundation knowledge that they got earlier in the program is directly relevant to what they're doing now. And it emphasizes that learning's a cumulative process.
Yeah, yeah. Makes sense. And this must also link to the whole curriculum design, right?
Absolutely. So the guide suggests that new lecturers really should be proactive in asking about the curriculum design. So find out, is it a spiral curriculum where things are revisited? Is it skills-led? Is it content-led? Understanding the design can help lecturers to tailor their teaching and manage expectations.
Yeah, so that broader context can really inform your day-to-day practice then.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing the guide talks about is this idea of building trust, building trust within the classroom.
Yes. And it points to the effectiveness of using things like anonymous feedback, simple things like post-it notes or online tools where students can give feedback without having to put their name to it.
Right.
Because when you do that, it can lead to much more honest and open communication. And when you have that trust between students and lecturers, it just means you can do much more meaningful work.
Yeah. I mean, if you're afraid to say that you're not getting something, you're not going to ask for help. You're not going to say anything. If you feel like you can be a bit more open and honest without fear of judgment, then you're much more likely to, speak up.
Absolutely. And the guide also introduces this concept of tacit knowledge within disciplines.
Tacit knowledge, okay.
So this refers to kind of the unspoken rules, the implicit understandings, the ways of thinking that are specific to a discipline. So, terms like critically analyze or evaluate might seem straightforward to someone who's an expert in a particular field, but to a student who's coming to that subject for the first time, it might not be so clear.
So it's not enough to just use the language, you actually have to explain it.
You do, and the guide argues that demystifying these expectations is actually a matter of fairness. And it's about inclusivity. It's about making sure that everyone's on a level playing field.
That's a really good point because, there is that kind of insider knowledge, right?
Yes.
And if you're not privy to that, then you're at a disadvantage.
Absolutely. And the guide actually warns against what it calls ghetto approaches to education, which is another really interesting concept.
Okay, what does that mean?
So it's this idea that education should really be working to challenge and eradicate any kind of intellectual or social segregation. It should celebrate diversity and make sure that every student, regardless of their background, their experience, their perspective, is valued and has equal access to learning opportunities.
Right, so it's about recognizing all those different perspectives that people bring to the classroom.
Exactly. And it actually encourages lecturers not to simply rely on their own experiences as students when they're thinking about their current students, because the student body is so diverse these days, and those experiences may not be relevant anymore.
Right, right. Okay, so the guide also looks at the work of Phil Race on student motivation, which I think is a really important aspect.
Absolutely. And Race highlights several key factors here. First of all, he says that students are human beings and they need encouragement, particularly when they're up against deadlines and they're having to demonstrate what they've learned. And he points to the important role of the personal tutor here as someone who can provide that human face, particularly when students are struggling.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because if you feel like there's someone who sees you as an individual, not just a number, it can be very motivating.
Absolutely. And, some students might not be motivated by the most kind of positive things. They might be motivated by avoiding failure, or they might be motivated by proving someone wrong.
Right, right.
And that's just a reality.
Yeah, we all have our baggage.
We do. And then he also says that need can be a really powerful motivator. So students who recognize that they genuinely need to learn something, whether it's for graduation, for their career, for a business they want to set up, these students tend to be much more resilient learners.
Yeah, they own it, right?
They do.
It's their learning journey, so they're invested.
Exactly. And Race also uses this great analogy of lecturers being catalysts for learning, which I really like.
Okay, yeah.
Because he stresses that the role of the educator isn't to just stand up there and give information. It's about making learning faster, more complete, less arduous. And that's where I think making learning relevant is so crucial.
Right. How do you make it relevant?
Well, the guide is very clear on this. It says, even when you've got learning outcomes for individual modules, you've got to be able to explicitly link those to the overall aims of the program and, crucially, to employability skills. And even if you're teaching a very theoretical, conceptual, philosophical module, you've still got to be able to articulate how what students are learning can be applied in the real world.
Right. So it's not just about the content. It's about the skills that you're building.
Exactly. And, of course, this extends to academics themselves. The guide talks about the importance of continuous professional development.
Lifelong learning, everyone.
Exactly. So it's about making sure that as academics, we're constantly updating our knowledge, we're adapting our teaching, we're making sure that we're inclusive, that we're aware of international perspectives, that we're challenging students enough, that we're making things relevant, that we're thinking about the needs of employers. Complacency isn't really an option.
Right. It's a constantly evolving field.
It is.
And obviously, in this day and age, digital platforms play a huge role.
Oh, absolutely. And the guide argues that digitally enhanced learning is absolutely essential in higher education now, particularly post-COVID. It's not just an add-on anymore.
Right.
And it's about finding really creative ways to engage students online through social interaction, through collaborative activities, through knowledge creation.
Yeah, because that's where the students are.
Right.
Exactly. So you've got to go to them.
You do. And
Yeah.
the guide really emphasizes the importance of actually listening to students. We can't just make assumptions based on our own experiences or our own ideas about how students learn.
Yeah.
We have to see the world through their eyes and use their perspectives to inform our teaching.
Okay, that's great advice. So the guide then goes on to talk about some really foundational concepts that are kind of the building blocks of good curriculum design, starting with Bloom's taxonomy.
Bloom's taxonomy. It's a classic, isn't it? And the guide presents it as this really fundamental framework for understanding how students develop critical thinking skills. So Bloom's basically categorizes those skills into a kind of hierarchical structure, starting with more basic things like knowledge and comprehension, and then going up to more advanced levels, things like application, analysis, evaluation, and creation.
So it's like a roadmap almost for how that learning process happens.
Exactly. And the guide explains that mastering the lower levels actually gives you the groundwork to then be able to engage with those higher order skills, that critical and creative thinking.
Right, right.
And then it also talks about how Bloom's taxonomy is actually used in practice to help educators define learning outcomes and to make sure that the assessments are aligned with those outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, it's been massively influential in higher ed, right?
It has. And the guide actually tells a really interesting story about where it came from. It says that it came about because university examiners at Chicago, they were looking for a more systematic and objective way to assess students, because they found that there was a real lack of clarity and consistency in how this was being done.
Huh. So it was really born out of a very practical need to be more objective.
It was. And what's interesting is that the guide also points out that there are other dimensions to Bloom's taxonomy, not just the cognitive domain. We often focus on the thinking skills, but there's also the affective domain, which is all about emotions and values. And then there's the psychomotor domain, which is about physical skills.
Okay, so it's a much broader view of learning than just, the intellectual stuff.
It is. It's about the whole learner. And the guide actually cautions against being too rigid in our application of these frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
So, while these frameworks provide structure, they provide clarity, there still needs to be space for students to be curious, to ask questions, to use their imagination. Real education, it's not just about ticking boxes.
No, it's about discovery.
It is. And it's about going deeper.
Yeah. The guide also talks about this idea of constructive alignment and the challenges that sometimes come up in curriculum design.
Yes, and sometimes you find modules that are poorly designed, and there isn't that really clear link between the learning outcomes and the assessment. And sometimes more junior staff, they might not have the power to actually change things, which is where having a mentor, someone with a bit more experience, can be really valuable.
Yeah, because they know how to navigate the system.
They do.
So the guide also revisits this idea of active learning and gives some really practical examples, which I thought was really useful.
Yeah. So, things like using Post-it notes for quick knowledge checks, using group work for peer-to-peer learning, using those digital platforms like Vivox and Kahoot for anonymous feedback, or just for making things a bit more fun and interactive. These are all great ways to engage students and to see if they're actually understanding the material.
Yeah, and it's that constant, engagement and feedback loop, right?
Absolutely. And that actually feeds into the guide's emphasis on the need for ongoing reflection for lecturers. It's about constantly asking ourselves, are we meeting the needs of our students, and how do we know? And really being open to their feedback.
So, we can always improve.
Always. We never know it all.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so the guide also talks about really understanding our student demographics, which I think is really important these days.
Absolutely. So understanding where our students are coming from, the knowledge they already have, the experiences they've had, is vital. If we don't do that, we can actually end up perpetuating inequalities in the classroom.
Right.
Because if we just assume that everyone's coming in with the same level of understanding or the same cultural background, then we're not being fair.
Yeah. No, it's about creating a level playing field.
Exactly. And the guide actually presents this idea of demystifying assessment as a moral imperative. It's about being fair, and it's about making sure that everyone has the opportunity to succeed.
Okay, I like that. It also shares this piece of research that I found really interesting about where students are most likely to disclose any difficulties they're having.
Yeah, and you might be surprised to hear that it's actually their teaching staff. So students are more likely to tell their lecturers about personal or academic problems than they are to tell other university departments or even the student union.
Huh. I wouldn't have guessed that. But it does kind of highlight the importance of that connection, right?
Absolutely. That rapport, that sense of trust that we were talking about earlier, it really is crucial.
Yeah. So the guide also talks about how higher education needs to evolve, especially in the wake of COVID.
Yeah. It actually uses this term re-envisioning, which I think is really apt.
Okay.
It's not just about going back to the way things were before the pandemic. It's about rethinking how we do things, how we design the curriculum, how we assess students, how we support them.
Right.
And, it mentions this really interesting example about how some students were embarrassed to access online tutoring during COVID because they were worried about their home environment being on display. And that just goes to show that we need to be thinking about creating really inclusive and comfortable learning environments for everyone.
Yeah, that sense of psychological safety, it's really important.
It is. So the guide then goes on to talk about active learning again, but this time in the context of promoting student ownership and metacognition.
Okay, so metacognition, that's thinking about thinking, right?
It is. And the idea here is that active learning techniques can actually encourage students to take more responsibility for their learning, to be more aware of how they learn, and to actively engage with the material instead of just passively receiving it.
Right, so it's about moving them from that passive role to a more active role.
Exactly. And the guide gives lots of examples. So things like group work, using polling apps to get instant feedback, think pair share activities, working with case studies, creating concept maps, even just having student-led summaries at the end of a session.
Yeah, I like all of that. And it really ties into this whole idea of how humans learn, right?
Absolutely. So, the guide emphasizes that we are naturally goal-oriented. We actively seek out knowledge. We build on our existing understanding, which is all in line with constructivist learning theory.
Right.
And inquiry-based learning takes this even further by getting students to actually do the research themselves, to discover things through real-world problems or scenarios. And that fosters a much deeper sense of ownership.
Yeah, it's like tapping into that innate curiosity that we all have.
Exactly. And I think it's really interesting how the guide talks about innovation and imagination, especially within environments that are often very driven by quality assurance processes.
Yeah, that's a tricky balance.
It is. But the guide suggests that it's really valuable to try to let go of some of those traditional power dynamics in the classroom and create more space for creativity, for shared learning experiences. Because imagination is what drives innovation. It's what helps us design better learning activities. And it's what we need to cultivate in our students if we want them to be able to solve problems and make a difference in the world.
Yeah. We don't want to just churn out robots. We want people who can think critically and creatively.
Exactly. And the guide even talks about dreaming differently as being the starting point for real innovation, which I think is a lovely image.
Yeah, I like that. It makes me think of that idea, the hermeneutics of suspicion as well,
Yeah.
that constant cycle of questioning.
Oh, absolutely. And the guide actually draws on the work of Paul Ricoeur here to highlight the importance of this continuous learning process, where we're questioning things, we're accepting new information, but then we're questioning it again. Because if we don't do that, we risk perpetuating old mistakes, old injustices. And this applies not just to the knowledge itself, but also to how we understand identity.
Yeah, I mean, identity is constantly evolving, right?
It is. It's never fixed. It's fluid. It's shaped by our experiences, by the stories we tell ourselves and others.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so coming back to the more practical side of things, how do we reconcile this need for creativity with all the QA processes that are in place in universities?
Well, the guide acknowledges that universities do have these fixed procedures, but it encourages academics to find those imaginative ways to teach and assess within those frameworks. So it's about seeing those regulations not as barriers, but as something to have a dialogue with.
Right, right. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can be creative and still meet those requirements.
Exactly. And the guide also makes a case for this broader definition of assessment. So it's about moving beyond just testing factual knowledge and really thinking about those demonstrable skills that graduates need for the world of work, for life beyond university.
Yeah, it's about preparing them for their future, not just for the exam.
Exactly.
So how can we improve those more traditional assessment methods then?
Well, the guide suggests focusing on giving students really good conceptual support, increasing the interaction within assessment tasks, maybe incorporating some elements of gamification, just to make it a bit more engaging,
Uh,
and really enriching the feedback that we give. So feedback should be part of the process, not just something that happens at the end.
yeah, I mean, that feedback loop is so important.
It is. And the guide really emphasizes the importance of building those feedback relationships. So it's about seeing feedback as a dialogue between the lecturer and the student, empowering the student to actually engage with the feedback and use it to improve.
Yeah, it's not just a one-way street.
Exactly. And it shouldn't just be written feedback either.
Okay, so what else could it be?
Well, the guide encourages us to think about things like recording audio feedback, little personalized messages, even creating podcasts or videos, and where possible, having those one-to-one feedback sessions, and even just sharing examples of good work, so students can see what they're aiming for.
Yeah, because sometimes it's hard to visualize what good actually looks like.
Absolutely. And then the guide also categorizes assessments based on their purpose. So it talks about assessment for learning, which is about informing our teaching, assessment as learning, which is about students reflecting on their own learning, and then assessment of learning, which is about actually measuring their achievement.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then it talks about this idea of assessment literacy, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. So this is about making sure that all students understand the criteria by which their work is going to be assessed.
Right, right.
And this is particularly important for students from widening participation backgrounds who may not have had that same level of exposure to academic expectations. So the guide is really calling for lecturers to be humble about their own experiences and really think about the needs of their students.
Yeah, because not everyone comes in with the same background knowledge.
They don't, and that actually links to the principles of fair assessment design.
Okay, tell me more.
So assessments should be designed in a way that's clear, even to someone who has absolutely no knowledge of the subject. And it suggests that we should think about offering students choice in how they're assessed, or even giving them practice runs to help them get used to different assessment formats.
Right, so you're removing those unnecessary barriers to success.
Exactly. And when it comes to designing effective learning tasks, the guide really stresses that we need to be clear about what knowledge and skills we're assessing. We need to give students plenty of guidance, we need to give them good feedback, we need to build their confidence, and encourage them to reflect on their own learning.
It's about making it a developmental process.
It is. And the guide also acknowledges that sometimes new academics come in and they inherit assessments.
Oh, yeah.
So it says in those situations, it's really important to take the time to understand those assessments and to collaborate with program leaders to make sure that they're supporting students effectively.
Yeah, you don't want to just come in and throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. You need to understand the context.
Yeah. The guide also really advocates for the use of authentic assessment, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. So authentic assessment is about designing tasks that actually mirror real-world contexts. Even if you're teaching a very abstract discipline, you can still use case studies, you can use simulations, and it emphasizes that the value of learning shouldn't just be measured by how much money a graduate is going to earn.
Right.
It should be about the contribution they can make to society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it's all about, isn't it?
It is. An authentic assessment should also be designed to promote higher-order thinking skills.
Okay, so what kind of skills are we talking about here?
So things like applying knowledge, solving problems, making decisions, analyzing situations. It's about helping students become those autonomous, critical thinkers.
Right, and those are skills that they can take with them beyond university.
Absolutely. And then there's this idea of transparency in assessment as well. So the criteria that we use to evaluate student work, it needs to be clear, it needs to be explicit. Students need to be able to understand what's expected of them and how to achieve it.
Yeah, because otherwise they're just guessing.
Exactly. And the guide also talks about writing skills, which is something that often comes up, right?
Oh, yeah.
And while obviously there are skills teams in universities to help with this, the guide argues that academics have a role.